Though we would like to think of ourselves as resilient and even immune to the painful things that happen in our life, the reality is that the things that happen in our life have a very real effect on us. And when they go unresolved, they will manifest emotionally, mentally, and physically. When a painful thing happens to us, it can easily become a trauma. A simple definition of trauma is distress without resolve. What should stick out to you about this definition of trauma is that this could mean anything from an infant being weaned to an embarrassing event to chronic experiences where you end up feeling like your worth to others is only about the quality of your performance, all the way to a veteran watching comrades being blown up by landmines at war, to complex sex abuse to trafficking. Trauma is something that happens in all demographics, across all societal classes, to people of any age, race, religion, sex. There are so many types of traumas that a person can experience. And everyone has trauma. Everyone has experienced distress in their lifetime that is unresolved. Everyone has made adaptations to their personality as a result of experiencing trauma. And everyone's current adult life is influenced by the trauma they experienced in childhood. And it is, in fact, these events that lie at the root of the vast majority of the problems we face and things we struggle with in our adult lives. As the field of psychology evolves, professionals will start to recognize more and more that the vast majority of behaviors that have been grouped and labeled as mental illnesses are in fact adaptations to distressing experiences. And more, doctors, health professionals will start to recognize that trauma is what lies at the root of the vast majority of physical illness. When we don't find a way to actually resolve a trauma that we experience, we become stuck in many ways in that moment of trauma. Simultaneously, the trauma becomes stuck in us, and we find ways to adapt to it. We develop coping mechanisms. These adaptations and these coping mechanisms allow us to survive distressing experiences in our lives so that we can keep on living despite the stress. They benefit us in some way when they are invented. But over time, we can see that the very coping mechanisms that benefited us are in fact the very thing that is hurting us and the people around us. These adaptations may serve us in some ways, but they tend to doom us in other ways, especially in the long run. Trauma changes the course of our lives. When a trauma happens, we make the painful thing that we've experienced mean something, and that in turn alters the way we think. It alters our entire perception of the world. People. The choices we make and the things we do change. Trauma changes the way we think. Trauma changes the way we feel. Trauma changes the way that our physical body operates. The symptoms of trauma can manifest as anything from changes in a person's personality to dysfunctional behavioral patterns and relationships to coping mechanisms that are super detrimental to negative self-talk, to flashbacks, to nightmares, to insomnia, to addictions, to anxiety and depression, to unrelenting thoughts about a specific past event or maybe even a series of events, to difficulty regulating anger and other emotions, to a general feeling of emotional numbness, to physical diseases and illnesses, to low self-esteem, to self-harm, to chronic pain, to mental illness, to simply this lingering feeling of a generally unsatisfying or painful life, and so much more. It is important to understand that the body is being informed every day, all day, by the thoughts you are thinking and the way you are feeling. The physical body is not like a separate machine. Most people who are struggling with a physical ailment, of course, have no idea that there are mental and emotional roots to every physical ailment. And this is one reason why a person can put so much effort into remedies and improvements that are solely aimed and focused at the body on a physical level and end up seeing such poor results. Because of this, trauma will manifest as physical ailments. This is so much the case that one could correlate specific physical ailments to specific traumas. So that you can understand how trauma manifests emotionally, mentally, and physically, I'm going to give you an example. Irene was brought to the United States by her parents from Eastern Europe. They were refugees. Though Irene never experienced war directly, she was caused great distress by the feeling of constant threat. Her parents always seemed in crisis, and she felt responsible to behave in ways that put no pressure on them at all. There was no predictability relative to where they would be staying, what they would be eating, when they would see loved ones again. All of that was in someone else's hands. Rather than being about an isolated incident, Irene's trauma was about the dynamics of how her life was day to day growing up. As a child, she usually felt too on edge to play. She did not feel secure or joyful. She felt guilty for having any pleasure because her parents were not experiencing pleasure at all. She needed to be comforted, but could not actively pursue that need because that would be to ask something from her parents, who were way too stressed out as it was. On a mental and emotional level, this trauma caused Irene to believe that the world is inherently unsafe, that everyone is way too maxed out to help anyone else, and that pleasure is something that she can't have, that life is not about pleasure. To cope with this, she suppressed, denied, and disowned the aspect of herself that is lighthearted and childlike and playful and joyful. Rather, she identified with a part of herself that could be serious, practical, perfectionistic, and that was a workaholic. She works herself into the ground now and does not prioritize joy at all. Doing this actually makes her feel safer because it makes her feel on top of and in control of the very sad reality of life, rather than at the mercy of it. Whenever she experiences a situation that is pleasurable in her life, she feels instantly guilty. Because of her often serious, cold, and hard way of being, people feel tense around Irene and are typically not drawn to her, so she experiences a severe lack of connection and affection. She carries herself with so much constriction in her tissues that her body posture is completely out of whack. Her shoulders are hunched, her chest is concave, and she is constantly experiencing back pain. And this complete denial of pleasure has negatively informed her body to the degree that she has developed type 1 diabetes. Her diabetes has served to only make the original issue that caused it worse, because now her condition makes pleasure even more impossible. She can't enjoy food at all. Food, or the lack thereof, is a constant source of anxiety for her. You might be thinking to yourself that Irene's situation seems extreme. After all, most people were not refugees as children, but trauma does not need to look like what we would traditionally call trauma to be trauma. Even experiences that you or other people might consider small or normal can be traumas that have a massive impact on your mind, emotions, and body. And don't forget, Irene doesn't understand that she experienced trauma, because what she experienced is so much better than what anyone else in her family experienced. And her parents, of course, love to tell her that because they brought her to America, she avoided all the bad things that could have happened. She has so much opportunity and convenience and food and water and shelter, and she's safe, unlike everyone who they left behind. Most people have not put two and two together regarding what they are experiencing on a mental, emotional, and physical level and the trauma they have experienced. They don't yet see that flow chart from the trauma to the effect the trauma had on them mentally, emotionally, and physically. There are a great many reasons for this, all the way from things like memory suppression, to normalization, to minimization, to adopting other people's way of seeing our experiences, to it being scary to admit to trauma because of whatever consequences we think will happen if we do, to traumas being hard to see because they're about what didn't happen rather than about what did happen, to simply committing no time to focus or think about it. It is critical that as a society we start to connect the dots and wake up to the fact that unresolved trauma manifests mentally, emotionally, and physically, as well as wake up to the fact that trauma lies at the root of the mental, emotional, and physical ailments that we are experiencing in our lives. There are so many modalities that exist to heal trauma. I myself have created one. It's called the completion process. If you're interested in how to do this process, you have 3 options. You can go through the e-course that I created, in which I explain the full picture of trauma on a much deeper level and walk you step by step through how to heal trauma. You can pick up a copy of my book that's quite literally titled The Completion Process, or you can go to thecompletionprocess.com and select a practitioner to walk you through the process. The completion process is the process that I myself used to overcome the kind of damage that most experts believed had no cure. When we resolve distress rather than just cope with it, we're able to weave that negative experience into the fabric of who we are in a way that benefits us. We're no longer plagued by painful negative emotion about it. We're able to live in the present moment without feeling like we keep getting dragged back to whatever was painful. Essentially, what happened is no longer controlling the way you feel or the way you behave in the present. You are no longer a deterministic byproduct of the traumas you experienced. By being aware of the picture of cause and effect as it plays out in your own life, you can consciously heal what needs to be healed, and by doing so, experience a different fate. Good week.